welcome back to Food Prep Guide. We're out in the garden today in our little onion row here, and it is time to harvest. It looks a little messy, it looks a little sad, looks like something maybe has come in here and torn it up, but that is not the case. They're simply ready to harvest. One of the wonderful things about onions is that they will tell you when they are ready by flopping over, basically. So we're going to harvest, and while I'm harvesting, we will chat about signs to know when they're ready, growing onions, just some tips and tidbits, and then we will go inside and I'm going to show you all the different ways that we're going to preserve this harvest. Let's get started.
You see me with some scissors here. So when I planted this is the first year that I have grown with weed fabric. And when I planted these onions and was burning the holes, I was thinking as small of a hole as possible to prevent as many weeds as possible. It didn't even dawn on me that, hey, these bulbs are going to get pretty big and might not be able to be pulled up through that hole. So I'll have to use the scissors a few times. That was unfortunate, but it is what it is. So this year we planted about 100 onions each of red Creole and Texas Super Sweet. I ordered my starts from Dixondale Farms. Highly recommend them. I have been ordering starts from them for years. I have tried growing onions from seed one time and it didn't work out very well. And I think in hindsight, I should have started them a whole lot earlier. So I'm going to try this coming up season to sprout my own, and I'm going to actually start the seeds in the end of November. Last year, or the year that I tried growing from seed, I started the seed in January, and the seedlings were just nowhere near large enough to go outside. So I'm going to try again this year, and we'll see how it goes, but I highly, highly recommend Dixondale Farms. This year, they ended up being a pretty good size. But this year, I did something that I have not done before, and that is I used ammonium sulfate as the fertilizer. In years past, I have always used blood meal, and it turns out fantastic. I mean, I actually, if I remember correctly, yeah, I use a combination of blood meal and bone meal. Onions are a tad bit different in that they are extremely hungry for nitrogen, but at the same time, they're a root crop, so we would normally think that they need phosphorus since they're a root crop. But onions are just a little bit different in that they actually still need more nitrogen than they do phosphorus. But I usually cover both of my bases and fertilize or amend the soil with bone meal and blood meal. But this year I took Dixondale's recommendations. They always recommend ammonium sulfate. That's how they grow their onions on their farm, and that's all they do. They specialize in all onions and shallots. So I did that this year, and I'm glad that I did. It was pretty cheap, fairly inexpensive, and one bag was enough to do both rows of approximately 200 onions each, and I'm pretty happy with the way that they have turned out. I also was a little concerned about the harvest this year because I would normally use a soil blend that I get from a local farmer here, and this year I was unable to get that in time to plant these onions. So I had to use Miracle-Gro. And I was thinking, uh-oh, I don't ever want to use Miracle-Gro in the garden. When I have in the past, things have not turned out well. But it was a matter of, get them in the ground with some Miracle-Gro and, still be able to harvest before it gets too terribly hot, or wait for the good stuff, which was going to be about 3 weeks, and it was going to put me behind schedule 3 weeks. So anyway, this is grown in Miracle-Gro. I did not do any tilling as we usually do, and I just laid the soil directly on top of the ground. I did use my stirrup hoe to do some weeding, and that is the only thing I did to prep the ground for this. I didn't do any tilling. I didn't dig down any fertilizers. When I talk about using ammonium sulfate, I literally just put the soil on top of the ground, top of my existing garden bed or soil. This is just ground, it's not raised bed. And then I just sprinkled the ammonium sulfate into that soil and mixed it in just a little bit with my fingers. So very easy, very low labor way to plant the onions. And as you can see, they did pretty good. So I'm happy with them. I mentioned that I wanted to share some tips about how you know that the onions are ready. So the neck of the onion is where that green stem meets the bulbing part, and that neck remains stiff throughout the entire growing stage. But when they start to near their days of maturity, that neck starts to get soft and it can no longer support the growth or the weight of the greens up top, and they start flopping over. So you saw how pretty terrible the onion row looked like. We did have a storm come through just a week before this, but the storm did not, that's not that, all of that was not storm damage. That was just simply what carrots look like when they're ready to harvest. They will start to brown at the top and just simply fall over. So these things were ready to go. I had rain. It had just rained. I don't know if you can tell, but the ground is soaking wet, and that is not ideal time to harvest onions. The ideal time to harvest onions is when you don't have any rain in your forecast for about a week, if you can swing that. You want things nice and dry to avoid rot, and it really helps with the curing process. If you don't have anywhere indoors to cure your onions, it really helps to wait and not harvest until you have a good week of no rain, plenty of sunshine, warm weather, and that helps with the curing process. You can see I sped up big time because it started raining. But it was fine. I pulled them today because I knew that I had rain in the forecast starting, well, right now. And then it was going to rain every single day for 6 days after that. So we had to do what we got to do.
Okay, here is the harvest of both the red Creole onions and the Texas Super Sweet. There's Domino living his best garden cat life. So I'm very, very happy with the Texas Super Sweet onions. I mean, you can see most of them are a decent size. Some of them are absolutely gargantuan, like this guy right here. I'd say the average size is probably about like this one is the average size. Very satisfied. I am not satisfied with the red onions because none of them got much bigger than, let me look for an average size one. I mean, it's okay. I'm happy because last year my onion harvest got completely wrecked by an armadillo. So I'm happy to have onions this year. And it is, it's a blessing, absolutely. It's just interesting that both of these onions were grown in the exact same spot, exact same fertilization, watering schedule, same soil, planted on the same date. And there's just such a dramatic difference in size between the red onions and the white sweet onions. The red onions, this variety, the red Creole, does have a longer days to maturity than the sweet white, but I have gone the full length of time for the red onions. And as we chatted about before, I can't go any longer with all this rain coming. So that's our harvest. Let's head inside and get to work.
Project number 1 is curing the onions. I'm doing something different this year, and I'm not curing all my onions. I will only be curing the onions that will be used for my canning projects. For the rest of the onions, we're going to go ahead and put them into ready-to-use formats because I find that when I'm cooking, that's what I reach for the most. So what I'm doing here is I'm squeezing the neck of the onions, and if they feel any slimy or if they just seem to be holding a lot of moisture right in that neck area, I'm setting it aside and considering it not a good candidate for curing. So when you are curing onions or potatoes or sweet potatoes, the idea is we want to get them as dry as possible. So these onions, like I said, it was raining right when I started harvesting and it was going to continue to rain. So this is not ideal conditions, but it's also a good example that things don't have to be perfect to get the job done. There are plenty of great candidates for curing in this batch. I'm just going through, I want the firmest onions. And then, like I said, I'm squeezing the head, the neck of it, and I'm trying to decide if it feels like it's holding a lot of moisture. The other thing that I'm looking at is for any signs of rot on that outer wrapper. So for curing, especially for onions, they form those wrappers, of course, and those wrappers are really helping to protect the onion during the curing process. So if the wrapper isn't good and intact, then it's not going to be a great candidate for curing. And the other thing that I'm looking for is them to be somewhat clean, but not totally clean. Like when you're curing anything, you don't want to wash the food first. You want that dirt to stay on there. That dirt can actually help protect the onion while it's drying out. But since I did harvest these when it was wet, I'm looking for, and I'm trying to avoid onions that have more mud on them and more so than dirt. So I'm just going through this whole batch. I want to set aside enough onions to get me through all of my sauces, relishes and things like that I have coming up. It's going to be several more weeks before we have tomatoes and peppers coming in, and that's what all of these onions are going to be sitting on the sidelines waiting for. To cure these onions, we are headed out to the garage. Please excuse the mess. That's just how garages are, at least in my life. So what we need to do is find a place for the onions to get good airflow around the entire surface of the onion. So what I don't have a curing station, like a technical built curing station, and I didn't even have anything set up when it was time to get these onions cured. So what I did is I just walked around my property and looked for some options. What I found out in the shed, I found this piece of closet wire like shelving. And then I just found a place in my garage where I could, set it on top of something and allow the onions to kind of hang through. And it worked out great. So you can see I'm just taking the greens and pushing them through so that the bulb of the onion sits on top of that wire shelving. And that's going to allow airflow to really reach around all sides of the onion. A second consideration for curing is you don't want it to be in direct sunlight, but it's really good if it gets some sunlight. That's going to ensure that it stays pretty warm, and that's kind of what you want for curing conditions. You want it slightly humid, not too humid. We obviously are going for dry here, but you also want it to be kind of warm. We don't want it in direct sunlight because that could lead to sun scald and end up with a inferior product. But here in this garage, of course, it's out of direct sunlight. It's in an enclosed building, but you can see light coming in through a window that's in that garage. So this was an excellent opportunity to get these onions cured. I ended up curing about 10 to 15 pounds. Most of my canning recipes call for 2 medium-sized onions, so I was going more by quantity than the amount of pounds, and we ended up curing approximately 15 or 16 onions. The next thing we want with curing is good airflow. Since it is in the garage, it's not getting wind, so I'm doing that artificially with just setting up a fan to help me do some curing. Those will sit in there for a couple of weeks until they're ready to be used for canning season. For project number 2, we're going to go ahead and separate the greens from the bulbs in preparation for cleaning. So for this year and in years past, I like to make use of the entire crop. So we're not going to let those green onion tops go to waste. We're going to preserve those too in 2 different ways. But for the most part, I'm just taking off all of the brown parts. I'm taking off any bits that are just unsightly, that just don't seem to be good quality, don't seem to be very clean. I'm trying to keep just the nice green parts of the onions, and then I'm just breaking them apart and putting them in this large bowl as I go. So slicing the top away from the onion, putting that in one bowl, cleaning up those green onion tops and getting those in another bowl in preparation to really give all of these onions and onion tops a really, really good clean. Once I've cleaned the onions thoroughly, we are ready to move on to our second project, and that is freeze drying some chopped onions. The first step is just I'm chopping off any pieces of that green stem that might be left, because I can still use that in a future project that we will get to in a minute. But for freeze drying the onions, I just want the bulb parts, so I'm just going through and peeling the onions in preparation for chopping. I'm going to be using this vegetable chopper. This is what I use every year for processing onions and potatoes. It makes quick work of a pretty tedious job. My son especially loves doing it. I think he just loves banging down that plastic thing. But as you can see, it works pretty well. So once I've got all the onions clean and peeled and all that, I just run it through this chopper, get them all nice and uniform diced and in preparation to go onto the freeze dryer trays. As far as loading up the freeze dryer trays, it's pretty self-explanatory. The only thing I do want to point out is that with freeze drying, we don't have to worry about the product overlapping like we tend to be concerned about with dehydrating. Everything dries evenly, even if it's piled on, and I do pile on the trays for sure. So once they are all chopped, they're ready to go into the freeze dryer. With freeze drying, there isn't a set time and temperature for things like it is for the dehydrator. You simply let the machine do its thing, and it has sensors that can sense when the moisture has reached the point of being finished. So you just let the machine go. I always add an extra 7 hours of dry time, and that's not because it necessarily needs it. It's just to prevent the machine from going off while it's in the middle of the night and I'm sleeping. Because when the process ends, it does send off like this beeping noise. So I just 7 hours of extra dry time prevents that from waking us up in the middle of the night. So when it's done, I do the feel test for cold spots. When freeze drying, cold spots equals moisture, so you want your food to feel warm to the touch. If there are any pieces that are cool to the touch, I go ahead and put it in for extra dry time. But these were good and ready to go, so I just got out my supplies and started loading up the jars. I like to pour all the trays into this big stock pot and then scoop them with a scoop. I find that it has minimized mess tremendously from the way that I used to do it, which was scooping them from the trays themselves. And whew, I lost a lot of product that way. So I switched to this method and it works pretty well. Once the jars are full, it's ready to seal them. I always vacuum seal all freeze-dried foods. That's what's recommended. You can do this 2 different ways, with a vacuum sealer or an oxygen absorber. I like to vacuum seal because it's quick and easy, and I don't have to continuously buy oxygen absorbers. This is an electric vacuum sealer. I highly recommend it when you have like a lot of jars to seal at one time. It sure makes easy work of a task that could take a lot longer and be a lot tougher on my muscles with the brake bleeder pump that I usually use. I thought I'd just throw this cute little clip in of my little helper. He loves helping me package up food. I think it's the scoop and that little tamp that you see. I love that little tamper. I actually got it in a fermenting mason jar kit. But one side fits well in regular mouth jars and the other side fits well in wide mouth jars. And it just comes in handy to get things packed up really nice and neatly. I'll have that linked in the description box below, along with the electric vacuum sealer. After everything is packaged up and good to go, it's just time to label. For things that are obvious like this, I only label with the year, so I'm just writing 24 on all of the jars. We ended up with 10 quarts of these chopped white onions. Of course, we still have all those others curing and for our future canning projects, so I'm really happy with this amount. On to project number 3, and that is preserving all of these onion tops. So to start, we're just going to chop them up nice and small in preparation for getting them really clean. You'd be surprised how many critters can climb up into that hollow tube of the onion tops and hide there. All they have to do is chew a little hole through them, and then they're inside that tube, and then they just take up residence. So I always use my salad spinner when I'm cleaning off pretty much anything from the garden, but definitely hollow things like these onion tubes. Not only does it get things nice and clean, but as you'll see here in just a minute, I think the centrifugal force helps to sling those critters out inside that water is none other than a gross slug. Ugh. Yeah. There's plenty of slugs, plenty of caterpillars that make their way into those onion tops, which is really disgusting. But anyway, once we are assured that things are nice and clean, we're going to package them up into gallon-sized bags, because one of the projects that we're going to do with onion tops is freezing them for different broths throughout the season. So as I go throughout the garden season, I harvest any of the scraps that are usable for broths. Onion tops, carrot tops, different leaves of things can be really good in making a chicken broth, a bone broth, or a beef broth in the future. So I like to have at least 4 gallons of these onion tops in the freezer waiting on me to throw into future broths. But project number 4 is specifically onion broth. So you noticed that I kept all the onion wrappers and the shorter stems of the onion tops, and that is to go into an onion broth. You can absolutely use the onion wrappers too, that way nothing goes to waste. So in addition to the onion wrappers and some of those onion tops, I do like to set aside usually 4 to 5 good-sized onions to toss into this onion broth as well, just to ensure that it is truly an onion broth and not simply a vegetable scrap broth. But onion broth is something that is my absolute favorite to have on the shelf. Of course, since we raise chickens and we process chickens, we have plenty of chicken broth, but I find that the onion broth is something that I pull off the shelf time and time again because the flavors just tend to go well with anything and everything. Whereas something like a chicken broth or a beef broth might be more picky and choosy on what kind of recipes I want to use that in, but this onion broth just really complements almost everything. This bag you see here of onion peels, that was from last year's harvest. So I had one bag each of onion peels and one bag of these carrot tops left over from last year's harvest. They're a little bit freezer burnt, but not past the point of no return. I'm fine using them in this broth. So I did go ahead and put in that bag of carrot tops as well, in addition to the onion peels. Now, once everything is good and in the roaster oven, all we need to do is add in our water. I don't measure the water, it's just enough to cover the contents of the roaster oven. But once we get that water in and get things stirred around, I like to season it with 1 tablespoon of salt. I'm using a half tablespoon here, so that's why I use 2 scoops. But 1 tablespoon of salt, half a tablespoon of black pepper. If you have black peppercorns, that would work good too. And then I top it off with 1 tablespoon of turmeric powder. The turmeric powder just gives it a really lovely golden color, which helps it to retain that nice just the really nice hue of that onion broth. Give that all a really good stir, and then we place the lid on, and I go ahead and put it to 350 degrees Fahrenheit to bring it up to a boil. Once it is up to a boil, we can lower it down to a simmer, which is around 200 degrees, and let it go overnight. You can allow this broth to cook up to 2 days if you prefer. But I just went overnight, and then in the next morning it's ready to can up. So I'm using my funnel here. You see I'm using the tea strainer, and that's just to get all of the contents out, so it's just the broth that's making it into the jar. We don't want any big chunks of onion peels or the carrot tops or anything like that going into the jar. But we just fill the jar up all the way to 1-inch headspace. Once we're at 1-inch headspace, we are able to move on and wipe the rins with a clean, damp paper towel or washcloth just to make sure there's no debris on there before we put on a new clean lid. I had these in simmering water, that's why you see me flicking off the water there. And then we just put the ring on to fingertip tight, which means just to the point of resistance, and I usually do a quarter turn more. And then they are ready to go into the pressure canner. Broths are low acid foods, so they need to be pressure canned in order to be canned safely. Be sure to follow your instructions for whatever canner that you will be using. For this one, it's just a simple push of a button. Onion broth needs to pressure can for 25 minutes. So that's what we did, and we ended up with 10 quart jars of this beautiful onion broth. I'm very happy with that. We actually still have plenty of onion scraps left in the fridge or in the freezer, so that if we wanted to make more, we could certainly make more, and I probably will because this is our absolute favorite broth to use. Moving on to project number 5, and that is pickled red onions. So we'll be using the red onions for this. To start, we need some red wine vinegar. You want to make sure you're using any kind of vinegar that has at least 5% acidity. As you saw, this one has 6% acidity, so we're good to go. You can go higher, but you don't want to go any lower than 5% acidity. Now, just to note that if I had enough red wine vinegar, I would be using only that for this recipe. I fell in love with pickled red onions because of Panera Bread Company. They have a salad where they use pickled red onions, and they're just phenomenal, and they use red wine vinegar in theirs. I did not have enough red wine vinegar to only use that, so I ended up having to use a mixture of vinegars here. Once I ran out, I switched to white wine vinegar, and I think the taste turned out fine, although I would have preferred to have all the red. But you just need 4 cups total of whatever vinegar you choose to use, whether that be white distilled or a wine vinegar like this. 4 cups total. After we have all of our vinegar in the pot, we can move on to our seasonings. So for the seasonings, you want 1 crushed clove, a garlic clove. I don't have any on hand. I'd like to use my ready-made, so I am using half a teaspoon of dried minced garlic. We freeze-dried this recently, so that's what I'm adding to the brine. This next mixture of seasonings is actually going to go into a bag. This is my nut milk bag. It looks really dirty and stained, but it's not dirty. It is stained. This is what I use for all of my jams and jellies, so it's been through blueberries and strawberries and elderberries and all of that. But you just want a pickling spice blend. Now, I used 1 teaspoon of black peppercorns, 1 bay leaf, and half a teaspoon of dried dill, but you can use whatever pickling spice blend you want. A lot of them have crushed red pepper in them. A lot of them have dill seed instead of dried dill. So whatever pickling spice you want approximately 2 teaspoons of whatever pickling spice that you're going to do. And you want to set that bag inside your brine. Make sure it's nice and submerged so that all those flavors kind of make their way into the brine, but not necessarily into your jars. We're going to put that on high, bring it to a boil, and then lower it to a simmer. While that's going, we're going to go ahead and chop up our red onions. We want thin slices here, so I'm getting as thin slices as possible, and I'm using the pint jars that I'm going to be, or half pint jars that I'm going to be canning them in, and I'm using those as like a measuring cup. So what I'm doing is I'm just going to fill all the jars and then use those jars to then dump into my brine, and then I'll know that I have enough. As you can see, I am stuffing them down in there pretty heavily. We do want to stuff them pretty good, all the way up to 1/2 inch of headspace. So 1/2 inch of headspace is what we want. Once I got all the jars done, it's ready to pour into the brine. I'm just dumping them into the brine and then replacing the lid and allowing those to simmer for 5 minutes longer. I did note that I ended up, those onions do shrink down. So in hindsight, I could have used fewer onions, so keep that in mind. Or you can do like me and just slice up some more onions to make up and use up the rest of that brine. But it needs to simmer in the vinegar brine for about 5 minutes. While that's happening, we can go ahead and prepare our canner and our jars. And that is just a matter of getting clean jars nice and warm so that we don't avoid, or so that we avoid thermal shock. I've also got my lids heating up and getting that resin on the lids nice and soft. Once everything is ready, it's time to fill our jars with the pickled onions. I am using a slotted spoon because I find that I can fit more onions into the jar if I load the solids first and then the liquids after. I have done it in the past where I just used a ladle and scooped the solids and the liquids out together, and it ends up with a product where the jar is not all the way full. Just like before, we want the onions to be 1/2 inch headspace. So once the onions are at 1/2 inch headspace, I switched to my ladle and pour the liquid on, again maintaining a 1/2 inch of headspace. After that, it's time to just debowl the jars, make sure you're maintaining that headspace, and then we're ready to put, well, actually we need to wipe the rims first. This recipe doesn't exactly have a whole lot to interfere with a good seal, but still, just good manner, of course, to go ahead and wipe your rims. Clean lid, ring on to fingertip tight, and then they're ready to go into the canner. You can see I have a quart jar of water here. That's because I didn't want those jars to be falling over in the canner load. And you can see that I have at least 1 inch of water over the 1/2 pint jars, not the quart jar, because I'm not concerned about actually canning that quart jar. So as long as those jars are submerged by at least 1 inch of water, you're good to go. You can see we were at a hard rolling boil, and only then do we set our processing time. These red pickled onions needed to process for 10 minutes, and so I let them process, and then I let them cool after processing for about 5 minutes, and then took them out of the canner, and I was pretty happy with the results. I ended up getting more 1/2 pints than I thought because, like I said, those onions cooked down a little bit, so I was able to go ahead and get 2 more 1/2 pints in there. And even I still kept that 1/2 quart jar of water in there just to make sure those jars didn't fall over. But we ended up with a total of 6 1/2 pints, and I've broken into one of them already. They are very strong, very potent. I wish I had all red wine vinegar, but the thing with anything pickled, is you really want it to sit on the shelf for several weeks before breaking into it. I had that one jar that didn't seal, so that's why I went ahead and put it in the fridge, and I have already tasted it. But the flavor is going to be much better after it sits on the counter for a couple weeks. Okay, last but not least, project number 6, and that is to preserve all the remaining onion tops. We are going to turn it into onion top powder in order to make some homemade spice blends. So you can see here, I'm just laying out some green onion tops onto the freeze dryer trays, and then into the freeze dryer they go. Just like I mentioned before, the freeze dryer is just going to do its thing. There's no particular time that I can tell you, but I will say that this load of green top onions mixed with 2 trays of red onions ran for about 30 hours. So when they are done, you just want to feel again for that warmth, feel for any cold spots. The green onion tops were done before those red onions. So the green onions were warm to the touch, were fine and ready to process or ready to package, but the red onions were not. Had to let them go in longer. Here they are all freeze dried, and then we're just going to run them through the blender. I am using the Vitamix dry container. I highly recommend it. I'll have it linked in the description box below. If you already have a Vitamix, invest in that dry container, and it will be a workhorse in your kitchen. If you don't have a Vitamix blender, you can use a food processor. If you don't have a food processor, you can use a coffee grinder. Just something to powder up these onions is all you need. So I'm just going to run them until I get a nice green powder. Every now and then I have to stop the blender, use a spatula to kind of push things down and get it nice and even, but we are just going for a nice smooth powder here. Once that is achieved, it's ready to package up into your jars. I like to store them in mason jars because it's easy for me to vacuum seal them, but you can store them in, of course, whatever you want. I'm putting it all in 1 quart jar for now, but I will be adding a lot of other spices and seasonings to this in order to make some blends later. So once it's full, we're ready to vacuum seal it up. You'll need that mason jar attachment in order to vacuum seal a mason jar, and then I'm just using this brake bleeder pump. It's a nice manual, non-electric way to get a good vacuum seal in your mason jars. I'll have both that adapter and the brake bleeder pump in the description box below. But as you can see, we get a good solid vacuum seal with that thing. I love it. It has been a busy last few days around here. We are almost done. We ended up with 10 quarts of onion broth, 10 quarts of our chopped freeze-dried white onions. I've got the freeze jar full of red onions right now. I've got this whole bowl here to do still. We're going to do the exact same process with the white onions, so I'm guessing I'm going to get about 9 to 10 quarts of chopped red onions as well. We ended up with 6 half pints of our pickled red onions. I've already got one in the fridge, snacking on that. We ended up with almost a quart of onion top powder. I'm going to mix that with some smoked paprika, garlic, salt, pepper, and kind of just make an all-purpose seasoning for cooking with. And then we have several bags of frozen onion tops in the freezer to make up some broths and stocks throughout the season as more type of scraps, vegetable scraps come in, and then we prepare to make a batch of chicken broth or bone broth, beef broth, anything like that. Okay, that just about wraps up the 2024 onion harvest and preservation. Still got some red onions, but we'll be done after that. I hope this video was helpful to y'all. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed filming it. We'll see y'all next time. Bye!